have a copy of the New Testament, turn to John chapter 9. John chapter 9, we're going to look at this story of one of the great healings that takes place in the life of Jesus. Attention is a powerful thing. We don't talk about giving attention necessarily. How do you dole out attention, generally speaking? You pay attention. You don't just give it to somebody. You pay attention like you're giving out money or something like that, because attention is very, very valuable. And what happens when you go for long periods of time without having someone's attention, you begin to feel neglected and ignored and invisible. And so many people in our society go through life on a day-to-day basis and they just feel invisible. They're completely ignored and they kind of get used to that. But the more ignored a person is sometimes, the more they are likely to misbehave and to sort of act out. In fact, when Annabelle was very, very young, she would act out periodically, as you know, 2-year-olds will do. And we actually taught her to say this phrase. Instead of acting out or going crazy or breaking something or doing whatever, we told her, you don't have to do that stuff. This came as a big relief to her. You don't have to do that. Instead, you can come right to Daddy and say, Daddy, I need some attention. And it was the cutest thing ever. This little 2-year-old would just walk right up to you. You know, we'd be in the middle of a conversation. We'd have people in our small group or other adults over in the house or something like that. And Annabelle was such a little grown-up, even when she was 2.5, 3 years old. And she latched onto it and figured it out. And she wouldn't act out and she wouldn't do crazy things. She'd just walk right up to you in the middle of conversation or whatever else is going on, walk right up to you and say, Daddy, I need some attention. And it's true. It's understandable. Everybody needs attention. And I'll just be honest right up on the front end of this message, and I'll tell you, this is not something I am very good at. I do have some absent-minded professor kind of tendencies that are deeply seated within me. For example, I had a little bit of a stressful, hectic day. It's been kind of a weird couple of days, some long phone call conversations and different things going on. I had some writing projects that I've been working on that are due this week. One, in fact, that's due tomorrow morning and is not done yet. And so, one of those kind of things. And right when I was getting ready to walk out the door to come here, I knew I needed to do a couple of things. I needed to make a phone call to somebody. I needed to get a haircut. And I needed to finish up my notes. So all of that is going on in my head. And at that immediate time, Annabelle did something that required my attention. My immediate attention needed to be with Annabelle for just a moment before I walked out the door. So Annabelle and I have this, kind of some FaceTime, and then I get in the van and I leave. I make my phone call. I get to the place where I'm supposed to get my haircut, and I look down. I left my briefcase at home that has my Bible, all of my notes, my laptop, everything. And it's 5 o'clock. So now I had to drive all the way back home. I just got on the phone with you, in fact. I had to drive all the way back home and get my notes and my briefcase, everything, just so that I could finish what I was trying to. I couldn't remember anything I was supposed to say. I called my wife and I said, is my briefcase there? And she said, yeah. And I said, I think I have to come back and get it. Can't you wing it? I'm like, no, I don't think I can. Not tonight. I got too many other things going on in my brain. It's very common for me to be sort of mindless about things. And I don't think, and my wife and I have this conversation frequently, I don't think it's that I'm a really rude person. It's just that I am frequently a thoughtless person. I'm not being mean to people. It just never occurs to me to be nice to them, That's just, that's just as honest as I can be about who I am and the way my brain thinks. It just never occurs to me, oh yeah, it would probably be a helpful thing for me to go out of my way. That's just not the way my brain thinks. And this is more common in our society than we care to admit. I won't ask for a show of hands on this because I'm afraid we'll have sore ribs afterwards. But women, you tell me, okay? If you're having a conversation with your husband and his nose is in the newspaper, or he's on his computer, or he's watching the game, or something like that, and you get frustrated, don't you? And you say, you're not even listening to me. Now, if he then says, I can recite everything you just said, and begins to verbatim replay every word that you've just said, is that satisfying to you? No, as a general rule, the woman will, now of course this could, I'm sure this could go the other way in some households, but for the most part, what the woman is saying in that situation is put the stupid newspaper down, turn the TV off, or at least mute it or something. Can I have your eyes? I want your attention. No multitasking right now. Can you give me, Daddy, I need some attention. That's really what is going on there, and that's deep in the heart of everyone. Everyone has this desire to have someone look at them and pay attention. Studies have been done that show how much it changes a person when they have attention paid to them. One study that I found that was really funny was a college professor. There was a study that was being conducted on him, and he didn't even know it. So I always think that's kind of a fun little reversal there. But this college professor, the study was, what happens if we play this little attention-giving joke on him? And so every time he would stand on this side of the class would look away. They'd look down at their notes, or they'd look at each other, or they'd look at their fingernails, or just look up in the sky, or something. And every time he walked to this one spot in the classroom, everyone looked right at him. And by the end of the semester, he never left that spot in the classroom. Wouldn't write anything on the board, wouldn't move. He'd just stay right there because he knew he had their attention. And I know as a speaker, when I go places, I'm not one of those. There are some guys who speak and you can kind of tell that they're not looking at anybody, they're just looking at the back wall. And you know, there are those kinds of speakers. And then there are these kinds of speakers that are constantly down in their notes. And I try as much as possible. I mean, there are certain people, certain faces, certain friendly folks that I know and look for anytime I'm teaching, because that gives me a sense of energy. That really does energize what I'm going to say. When I know there's somebody who's really paying attention and is really tracking with me and is sort of, up on the edge of their seat, it gives you an idea that what I'm saying is worthwhile and that these people really do care for me. The power of attention is so vitally important. We don't just give attention, we pay attention because it's so valuable. Now, this brings us to the blind man in John chapter 9. So, John chapter 9, start in verse 1. As he went along, Jesus saw a blind man, a man blind from birth. Verse 2. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Verse 4, as long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And having said this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. And this word means sent. So the man went and washed, and he came home seeing. Now his neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? And some claimed that he was, but others said, no, he only looks like him. But he himself insisted, I am the man. How then were your eyes opened, they asked. And he replied, the man they called Jesus made some mud, put it on my eyes, told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see. Where is this man, they asked him. I don't know, he said, which is a great thing to say periodically. It's really refreshing, and it sort of just takes all the burden off of you just to say periodically, I don't know. So we're all going to say this together. You ready? On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. I don't know. That's one of the great themes of this chapter. I don't know. If you're an underlining kind of person or a highlighting kind of person or a circling kind of person, you might want to look through the chapter and just circle every time that phrase occurs, because it happens 3 or 4 times. I don't know, which is one of the great things that you can use in your life is to remember you don't have to know everything in order to have this dramatic encounter with God. You don't even have to know everything in order to tell other people about this dramatic encounter with God. All you really have to know is what's happened to you. That's what we're called to be, is not to be experts in theology. We're not called to have PhDs in systematic theology or to understand every fine point of the law. All we're called to is to be witnesses to what God has done in our lives. And periodically, people are going to ask you questions about God. Yeah, well, if God is so cool, then why this and how come that? And it's okay for you to look right back at them and say, I don't know. This is what I do know. I used to be blind, and now I can see. And that's about all I know. And that's perfectly appropriate. All right, now, you ever drive by an intersection or something? This probably happens more as you head inside the perimeter, but it's creeping out more and more into the suburbs. Drive past an intersection, and there's that guy with the sign, the will work for food sign. One of the things that's always interesting to me is when you get into that encounter, when you get into that situation, when you get to that intersection, look at the other people in the other cars and what they're doing. And you will be amazed at what they can find to busy themselves with. Now, all of a sudden, I have to reach into my glove compartment to get something, or I dropped something under my seat back in November, and I think I need to get it out now, or, boy, I don't like this song, or, is there something in my teeth? They will do everything they can think of. What are they trying to avoid? Eye contact, right? You don't want to look at him, because if you look at him, you have to respond at somehow, right? If you look at him and those eyes meet, then I either have to dig for some loose change or I just have to tell him, no, sorry buddy, you're out of luck. And most of us really want to say that. We just don't have it in us to say that to him, you know? We don't want to be mean, but at the same time, I don't want to give him anything, so I'll just avoid eye contact. And that's generally what people will do when they're encountered, when they come face to face with somebody in that situation. Well, that's what this guy had lived with for his entire life. Here is a blind guy. We'll find out later that he's a grown man. He's been blind his entire life, and he's been begging in the same place day after day after day, and people just ignore him. People look past him. People look through him. It's awkward. If I make eye contact, I'm going to have to respond. People wanted to avoid this guy, but not Jesus. The whole encounter starts, verse 1, as he went along, Jesus saw a man blind from birth. How many people walked past this guy every single day and didn't even see him? Didn't even know he was there. You get used to him. He's like part of the landscape or something like that. We can look through people and ignore people to such an extent that we forget they're there. Now, if you're an underlining, circling, highlighting kind of person, the real theme of this chapter is the word to see. And so if you'll just go through some point in time and look at chapter 9 and just underline or circle or highlight every time you see the word see, saw, seeing, seen, those kinds of words are really key to this chapter. In fact, they're kind of a theme to John's entire gospel. They fit in with the way John describes Jesus, for example. In the very first chapter, Jesus is described as the light that shone into darkness. And we saw last week how bright that light can be and how painful that light can be sometimes. And so in John chapter 3, he says, the light shone in the darkness, but men preferred the darkness over the light. And so they withdrew from that. And so now Jesus comes right out and claims, as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And whether or not you see what there is to be seen, that's your choice, and that's what this chapter really is all about. Jesus sees this guy. And the dramatic encounter does not begin in this chapter with the blind man noticing Jesus. See, the first two encounters that we've talked about, the leper comes to Jesus and initiates that. And Nicodemus, last week, Nicodemus comes to Jesus and initiates that encounter. Here, there's just a blind guy standing by the side of the road, and he's minding his own business. He doesn't even know Jesus is there. Jesus sees him, and Jesus initiates this. And the first truth that we pull out of this chapter is this. Jesus pays attention. Jesus notices. He notices every single detail of your life. And if there's anything in your life that you think Jesus misses, you're wrong. Jesus is vitally concerned with what's going on in your life. Now, for a lot of people, that creates anxiety. But That can really be a liberating thing. Jesus knows. He sees. He hears. And you, on your worst day, Jesus knows. And one of the things that means that He knows how bad you really are. It makes it really hard to disappoint Him. Because He knows. He knows what's really going on inside of you. He pays attention to every single aspect of your life. And rather than that being an alarming, oh no kind of experience for you, that can be a liberating, refreshing, at last, somebody who knows me completely and still accepts me unconditionally. You want to talk about what freedom really is? Freedom is being known completely and being accepted unconditionally. And so when Jesus calls you to freedom, He's calling you to come out of hiding. Because I see you back there anyway. You're not fooling me. Come on out. I accept you with all your faults and all your flaws and all the junk and all the baggage and all the darkness and all the everything. I still accept you. Now, will you come out of hiding, come out of the darkness, come out, stand in the light, and just stay there until your eyes get adjusted and you can start to see. All right? Now, Jesus sees this guy, and as a result of Jesus seeing him, the disciples also see him, and they ask a kind of a bizarre question if you think about it. Look at verse 2. Disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Which, the more you think about that question, the more bizarre it is. But there are still lots of people who think this is that this is the way things work. In fact, I read a story today about a British soccer coach who was one of the assistant coaches for the British national team, this is several years ago, who was dismissed for his job for saying publicly that people who had disabilities or people who were disfigured or people who struggled with chronic illness or disease or disfigurement, that they were actually paying for the sins of a previous life. He said that publicly, and the outcry was so huge that he was eventually dismissed from his job. Now, he was a Hindu, and there are some Hindus who will reject that, but most people of Hindu faith believe in karma, and they believe in reincarnation. And so, if you are born with some sort of deformity or something wrong with you in this life, odds are it's because you're having to pay for something you did in a previous life. That's the way reincarnation works. We think reincarnation, woohoo, it's a second chance. No! Reincarnation is awful. You don't want reincarnation because every bad thing you do comes back in spades in your next life. And you're going to be an ant, or you're going to be a dung beetle, or you're going to be just something awful in your next life. So that's a downward spiral you don't want to go down. You don't want to say, wow, reincarnation sounds kind of interesting. No, it does not. It sounds awful and horrible. Okay, but that's the way a lot of Hindu people believe. But it's not just people who believe in Hinduism or reincarnation. There's also, and we've talked about it in this class before, this doctrine called the doctrine of divine retribution, that God pays you back in this life for stuff that you've done. And a lot of Jewish people in Jesus' life really believed that. We talked about that 2 weeks ago, that leprosy was oftentimes viewed as judgment from God. You didn't just get leprosy. You were given leprosy as a curse by God to pay you back for something bad you had done. And a lot of people really believed that there was this connection between sin and suffering. But for the Jewish people, this particular case would have caused them a unique sort of problem because he's born blind. He's born that way. So it couldn't have been something that he did. Could it have been something his parents did, I guess? That's what they were thinking. I guess it's something their parents did. And there was a belief that if a woman sinned in a particularly heinous way while she was pregnant, that her child would bear the curse that sin incurred. So they would have thought that this mother, can you imagine? It's not bad enough as a mother when it begins to occur to you and your husband that this beautiful baby that we had longed for so much, that we had carried for 9 months, that we had prayed about, we had rejoiced about, we'd had parties over, this baby is unable to see. And now all of the people around you blame it on you. Can you imagine what that is like? What that household is like to grow up in? And that's what this guy is facing. It must have been the parents. There's some kind of connection between sin and suffering. This guy probably deserved this somehow. And as inhumane and cruel and crazy as we think that might sound, you know, it wasn't too long ago that we heard lots of people speculate on why something like Hurricane Katrina struck a city like New Orleans. As if somehow or other, those people's sins are worse than ours are, you know. And that the people in New Orleans, you know, that somehow or other, the suburbs get off scot-free with all of our greed and all of our everything, you know, the craziness that we live with. Our sins aren't as bad as those people down in New Orleans, and so they got what they deserved. Or the folks over in Sri Lanka, I mean, they're just godless pagans, and so that's why the tsunami hit there. Or 9/11. We saw religious leaders stand up in the press and say 9/11 happened because America somehow or other brought this on themselves. There's still somewhere in us something that gains some kind of crazy, twisted comfort from the idea that somebody who suffers has done something to deserve it. They've brought this on themselves. And yet, I didn't hear anybody preaching out of John 9 right after Hurricane Katrina. I didn't hear anybody preaching out of John 9 after 9/11. And maybe that's where we should have camped. Because Jesus makes a once and for all statement that totally negates this idea. Here's this guy. He's born blind from birth, and he's a beggar. Now, if you walk past this guy, if you're the neighborhood, like homeowners association or something like that, this is not good. This violates your covenant somehow or other. I mean, this is depressing, and this is a burden on society. It's demanding. I don't like it. Mothers would use this, parents would use this as an example to warn their kids. Now, see, if you don't obey, something like that could happen to you. You stay away from him. You don't talk to him. You don't touch him. He has done something that has brought this on himself. And Jesus comes and notices him. And the disciples say, who sinned, this guy or his parents? And Jesus says, oh, you really don't get it, do you? God has not forsaken this guy. God has come to this guy. God has come for this guy. That's the reason why I came. See, this guy is a prime candidate for a dramatic encounter with Jesus. You want to know why? He wants something and he doesn't deserve it. And those are the people Jesus looks for. People who want something and they don't deserve it. And until we all get in that mindset that says, you know what? I don't deserve what I want. Until we get there, we probably will miss the opportunity to have a dramatic encounter with Jesus. Because we all want stuff. And if we're really honest, none of us really deserves it. But that's the kind of person Jesus looks for. Okay, now, look at verse 3. Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. And verse 4 is one of the two kind of key verses in this whole chapter. The other one comes down in verse 39, but look at verse 4. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. And while I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Now, first of all, this phrase, while it is day, as long as it is day. The implication is that it won't always be day, right? I mean, daylight doesn't last forever. Eventually, night comes. What Jesus is saying is there is a time. There's a window of opportunity that opens up for each one of us. And while that window is open, you have the opportunity to do the works of God. It's a limited time offer. It will not last forever. And we hear that phrase so often, and we just become immune to it because we know when the bank sends you the thing, 3.9 financing balance rollover, it's a limited time. We know, yeah, right. 2 weeks from now, I'm going to get 5 more of these, right? We know another limited time offer is coming, but Jesus really means it here. I'll give you an example. Steve, we were talking just a minute ago. My daughter Annabelle she's allergic to wheat. Makes a really bad itchy rash and So it's kind of a hassle, but we've just gotten used to it, and that's just part of our life. We eliminate wheat in her diet, which makes school lunches particularly problematic, because schools don't care about that. You know, I mean, they're going to do what they're going to do. Well, one day per month at my daughter Annabelle's school is Nacho Day. And Nacho Day is looked forward to with great anticipation, because on Nacho Day, she gets to be normal. She doesn't have to bring her lunch with her wheat-free, gluten-free, taste-free bread. You know, she gets to have what all the other kids are having, and nobody has to say, ooh, what is that? You know, she gets to eat what everybody's eating. So Nacho Day is like the highlight of the month. So we look forward to it all month, and it's on the calendar, and we know what day it is. You know, it's a big, big deal. Now, imagine what goes on today when my wife takes my daughters to school and discovers that Nacho Day was yesterday. Oh. Aren't there any leftover? Could we just, where's Superman to fly around the world backwards? We could do this yesterday. Nacho Day comes once a month. And my daughter was heartbroken. I mean, she just came undone. Because Nacho Day only comes once a month. And you can't go back. There's only one time, and there are no makeups. Jesus is saying there is a limited amount of time. And the worst thing you can ever hear is Nacho Day was yesterday. While it is still today, as long as it is day, there's a limited window of time to do God's work. It will expire. You could miss it, and you don't want to miss it. Now, also notice this. Jesus does not say in verse 4, as long as it is day, I must do the works of him who sent me. What does he say? We. So actually, the disciples, and by extension, all of us, we're invited into that. There is a limited amount of time for you to do the works of God, of the one who has sent you to this earth. And that's one of the hardest things for us to believe, is this idea that somehow or other I have been invited and empowered to do the work of God. That's just such a hard thing for so many of us to get our arms around, that I might be invited to do the work of God. I mean, the work of God, that should be for, you know, a select few people, not everybody, but Jesus says, as long as it is day, we must do the work of God. There was a very, very deep and theologically profound movie that came out years and years ago. It was set in the city of Chicago, and it concerned two brothers named Jake and Elwood. Do you guys know what movie I'm talking about? The Blues Brothers, right? Yeah, the Blues Brothers. Which was rated R, by the way. How do you know about this movie? I have only read about it in books. You remember the premise, though. Jake and Elwood Blues are two godless, heathen, pagan people who are as far away from God as you can imagine, and yet they're struck with a call to do the work of the Lord. And they go around and they get into these crazy predicaments, but they have the same refrain, goes over and over again. We're on a... This says a lot about you guys, that you know it that well. We're on a mission from God. And it's laughable, isn't it? Here are these two crazy, pagan, godless people so far away from God. They have kind of a code of ethics, but it's certainly not a biblical code of ethics. It's laughable, isn't it? And that's the point. That God chooses people just like Jake and Elwood Blues, people right out of jail, people whose resume would get them disqualified from working at Starbucks, people who would never in a million, no offense to people who work at Starbucks, I mean, you know what I mean. That you would be on a mission from God, that's crazy talk. And yet, you must come to believe it. That God has called you, and not just called you to get you into heaven in the great by and by when you die in the sky and all that, but that God has called you to do something in the here and now, to be an agent of transformation, to be a person who expands the borders of His kingdom, to be an agent of redemption, to be a bringer of hope, to be a spreader of little God germs everywhere you go. God has called you. You are on a mission from God. It sounds so lofty and important and so intimidating, and yet you must come to believe it. Not just something that you kind of go, oh yeah, I kind of buy that, but something that sinks way down into the depths, into the core of your being. And here's why this is so important. If you don't come to believe this, you can miss it. The window of opportunity could close before you even realize that you've been sent here for a purpose, and you've been given a mission, that you're here not just by random chance, that you're not just the product of chance plus time, but that God specifically created you, put you in a specific place and location and time for a specific purpose. You are on a mission from God to do the work of the one who called you, created you, redeemed you. It's so vitally important because you don't want to miss it. Now, by the way, I want you to notice this. When and where did Jesus do the work of God? Look at verse 1. As He went along. Now see, this is one of the barriers to us actually doing the work of God, is this idea that the work of God takes place in a certain location and at certain times. You know, we build God a house. It's the Lord's house. Did you ever hear that when you were a kid? Especially, that's usually associated with a command. Don't run in the Lord's house, right? Isn't that what you heard when you were a kid? That always baffled me when I was a kid. Like, what? This is God's house? All these bathrooms and no bedroom? I mean, that's just weird, you know? It's God's house, you know. We build God's house, why? So that He doesn't have to live at ours, right? And we have the Lord's day. The Lord's day so that we can have the other 6. And we have this idea that the Lord's work takes place in the Lord's house on the Lord's day. But the truth is, for Jesus, Jesus did the work of the one who sent Him as He went along. And you don't have to have a position or an office or a title or status. You don't have to have a great location. You don't have to be empowered by anybody other than the one who has already empowered you in order to do the work of God. And it's primarily going to take place as you go along. In unremarkable places. In unremarkable times. Just as you go along. That is how the work of God gets done. This is your day. This is your opportunity to do the work of the Lord. There have been other days that have come before us. There have been other people who have gathered in other rooms very similar to this and heard messages, no doubt, very similar to this. And that was their day. And there will be other days to come. There will be others who follow you. None of us will live forever. And I'm sure if Jesus continues to wait in patience, that people will open up John chapter 9 and they will hear messages like this again. A whole generation will rise up and they will have their day. And when you stand in front of God, He is not going to ask you about days gone by, and He is not going to ask you about days yet to come. He is going to say, what did you do while it was day? While it was your day? Did you do the work that I sent you to do? You don't want to miss this. You will be accountable for what you did on your day. Night is coming. You are on a mission from God. As crazy as that sounds, it really is true. If God's kingdom is going to break through into our world. And so many of us pray this on a regular basis. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. If God's kingdom is going to come today, it's going to come through you. Or it won't come at all. You don't want to miss this. Now, big question, what is the work of God? Lots of people have debated about this, and different theologians have different ideas. What is the work of God? Look at verse 13, and we'll see one example of what some people thought the work of God was, okay? Verse 13. They brought to the Pharisees the man who'd been blind. Now, the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened a man's eyes was a Sabbath. And if this was like a dramatic reading, that's where we'd put the bum, bum, bum music, okay? It was a Sabbath. Bum, bum, bum. Okay. Therefore, the Pharisees also asked him how he'd received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. See, for them, the work of God was keeping the law. And they had done this thing, and I'm sure at some point in time we'll talk about this over the course of the next year. We'll talk about what's known as a fencing of the law. Just real briefly, this would be what is known as a fencing of the law. God always gave the law for people's own good. He never gave anything just so it would be hard and weird and complicated. It was always for your own good. So, for example, God might come along and say, no one may stand on this stool. If you stand on the stool, you could fall, you could hurt yourself, you could fall on somebody else, you could hurt somebody else. It's just don't stand on the stool, okay? That's the law. Now, religious leaders would come along and say, you know what? You probably shouldn't even lean on the stool. Because if you lean on the stool, you'll be tempted to stand on the stool, you see? And so you're just better off not even, because you know it's forbidden to stand on the stool, so now we forbid it that you should even lean on the stool. Now, the next generation of religious leaders comes along and says, you know what? Don't even touch the stool. Because there's really a fine line between touching the stool and leaning on the stool. And you don't want to lean on the stool, because if you lean on the stool, you'll stand on the stool. And the next generation comes along and says, don't even look at the stool. Then you can't even be in the same room with the stool. You see where this goes? I mean, how far out does it go? That's what religious leaders... Boy, aren't you glad we grew out of that? I could preach for an hour and a half right now. They said, see, God said honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. They invented 39 things you had to avoid on the Sabbath in order to keep the Sabbath, to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. 39 things. And for them, the work of God was avoiding those 39 things. One of those, you couldn't pluck a hair from your head. You couldn't light a candle. Because if you lit a candle, then you could cook food, and cooking food is work, and you can't work. So you couldn't spit. You couldn't spit, because if you spit, it could roll down the hill, and it could form mud, and making mud is work. You see how crazy it gets after a while? Again, it's a good thing we grew out of that. All right. But so for them, avoiding these 39 things, that is the work of God. The work of God equals keeping rules. So many people who this is where the train gets off track for them. Because the work of God is keeping rules. And Jesus says, no, it's not rules. It's relationships. It's people. What is the work God has been up to, vigorously pursuing for 4,000 years to this point? Now 6,000 plus years. What has God been doing all this time? What is the work He is trying to accomplish? He is building a community of people who are rightly related to Him and rightly relating to Himself, to each other. That's what God is up to. That is the work of God. It's not rules. It's people. If I'm really honest, you want to know why I'm so busy looking past people? Because I'm busy thinking about rules. I'm busy worrying about my own stuff and trying to stay in the boundaries, and I neglect the people that God has put in my life. Jesus says, no, it's not about rules. It is about people. In fact, one time people came to Jesus and they said, look, we got all these laws, 635 of them that we've come up with now, 39 of them just about the Sabbath and you know how you can't spit and make mud and pull a hair out and light a candle. Can you bottom line this whole thing? Because 613 laws are hard to remember. You got them written on all your fingers 5 times and down your arms and on your head. And so can you just bottom line it? And Jesus said, I'll give it to you in a nutshell. You want to know what it is? This is what it is. You love God. You love people. That's it. Everything in the law and all of the prophets, everything hangs on those two clotheslines. 1, love God. 2, love people. Oh, and by the way, don't think you're going to fool God by saying, oh, I love you, when you don't love the people around you. John takes that one up in 1 John. Don't say, I love God, and you don't love the people around you. How can you love God? You haven't even seen Him. You don't love the people around you. You can see. They're not, they're inextricably tied together. Love God, love other people. You want to know, if you just had to, just bottom line it, absolutely, irreducible minimum. What is the work of God? Love. That's it. That's what it comes down to. Love God, love others, love yourself. That's what it comes down to. And you know what? Love does a lot of different things. Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 goes through all the things that love is not and all the things that love does. But you know where it starts? Love starts by paying attention. Love starts by noticing. There was something going on with my wife the other day, and she and I were having a conversation, and she told me something that was really bothering her. And it occurred to me that she'd been struggling with this for a while. And I hadn't even noticed. I say I love her. That's one of the reasons we got married, you know. I want to spend time with her, and yet so many other things in my life keep me from doing that. Keep me from noticing what's going on in my kids' lives. What's going on in my wife's life? What's going on with the friends around me? Jesus says, listen, it all comes down to love. The rules are there to show you how to love people well. But understand, it's a first things first kind of deal here. It's not about keeping rules. It's about loving people. Now, you want to see how ignored this guy was? Look at verse 8. Go back up to verse 8. His neighbors, he'd already been healed now, okay? And now he's going around. And his neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? And some claimed that he was, but others said, no, he only looks like him. Now, this is a grown man who's been in one place all this time begging, blind since the day he was born, and they don't even know what he looks like. Well, maybe it's him. It kind of favors him, in eyebrows or something. They never stopped long enough to be able to recognize this guy. We have the ability, this uncanny ability, to see people without seeing them. I want to give you 2 questions. We'll finish the chapter in just a minute, but I want to give you 2 questions to think about this week, okay? Here's the first question I want you to think about. Are you paying attention to God? Because I could ask you, do you love God? You remember when we were kids in Children's Bible Hour and we'd sing, oh, boys, do you love Jesus? And the boys would say, yeah, you're not a boy, though. See, the boys are supposed to sing along there. Right? Are you sure you love Jesus? Oh, you guys are so like camera shy or something. But then you would flip it around and you'd sing, oh, girls, do you love Jesus? And it would become this screaming match. Who could be the loudest? I could ask you, do you love Jesus? And you would say, of course we love Jesus. And I would say, are you sure? Yes, we're sure. But if I stopped and said, are you paying attention to Him? Can you answer that with as much vigor? Can you say, yes, I'm sure I'm paying attention to Him? See, now it gets really practical, doesn't it? Now it's not theory. Because we could all say, yeah, I get warm fuzzies in my heart when I think about what Jesus did for me. But do I actively pay attention to Jesus? Are you paying attention to God? And the second question I want you to ask, are you paying attention to people? Because it all comes down to love God, love people, right? That's what we just said. That's what we affirmed. It all comes down. Those are the 2 things. Everything else hangs off of that. Love God, love people. How about we just insert that phrase, pay attention to God, pay attention to people. M. Scott Peck says, love is a form of work, and the primary form it takes is attention. Now, something weird has gone on in this chapter. Clearly, a miracle has taken place. Nobody doubted that this guy was born blind. Everybody affirms that, and yet now here he is hopping around, he can see. Here's a guy who's been ignored his entire life. Now all of a sudden he's the center of everybody's attention. Everybody wants to talk to him, and they're all grilling him, asking all these questions, and he's probably thinking, can we throw a party or get a cake or something here? I mean, I can see. Can we just be happy for me for a second? But no, they've got to ask him all these questions, okay? Clearly a miracle has taken place, but the Pharisees don't want to see, because what happens when you make eye contact? You got to respond, don't you? You got to either start digging around for loose change, or you have to say, sorry, buddy, you're out of luck. And they don't want to do either of those, so they're trying to avoid eye contact. They don't want to see that a miracle has taken place. They're trying to avoid that altogether. Verse 18. They still did not believe that he'd been blind. Now they're trying to say he wasn't blind, trying to discredit the whole thing. And received sight until they sent for the man's parents. Now this is fascinating. Is this your son, they asked. Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see? And the parents' response is just, it's heartbreaking to me. We know he's our son, the parents answered, and we know he was born blind. But how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He's of age. He can speak for himself. They're not willing to go very far out on that limb to protect their son, are they? He's of age, which indicates he's an adult. Ask him. Now, verse 22 tells us why they were afraid. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who already had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. And it's not like just being... nowadays when we talk about disfellowshipping someone, like big deal, they just go to the next church down the street and they don't like us anyway, and so they'll take him gladly and say, finally, you left those heretics, right? I mean, that's just the way churches tend to work. I'm sorry, did I say that out loud? But see, for them, this was a much bigger deal. Because getting thrown out of the synagogue was the center of town, a center of civic life. If you get thrown out of the synagogue, you might as well just move to a new town. That's what you'd practically have to do. Nobody would have anything to do with you. They're afraid that that's going to happen to them, and so they just say, don't ask me. I don't know. Fear makes you do crazy things. Fear will make you close your eyes when the truth is staring you in the face. We don't know. Ask him. He's a grown man. Verse 24. So a second time, they summoned the man who'd been blind. Again, I mean, imagine this. This guy has probably never had a conversation with these people before in his life, other than to say, hey, could you spare a get a job? Why don't you probably brought this on yourself? Now all of a sudden, he's the center of their attention. And they say, give glory to God and tell the truth. We know this man is a sinner. And his response is classic. He replied, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. I do not know. One thing I do know. I was blind, and now I see. And then they asked him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered, I've already told you, but you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? A little sarcasm there. I mean, this guy is, probably had it up to here with these guys. Can you just throw me a party or something? Can you give me a present or a card that I can read? Because I can read now, I can see. But no, they got to keep grilling him. Then they hurled insults at him and said, you are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses. But as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. And the man answered, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. In other words, you can't see, but I can. Now we know that God doesn't listen to sinners, right? Follow me through on the logic of this. Let me draw this out. A, B, C, all right? We know God doesn't listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he couldn't do it. Therefore, you draw the logical conclusion here. And to this they replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. La, 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 la. We don't want to hear the truth. What other word can you use to describe them at this point in time? They are blind. Now, I just want to read this to you. I don't want you to turn here because we're running out of time very quickly. But this is from Isaiah chapter 42. Isaiah 42. I should have bookmarked it. Here we go. Isaiah 42. This is verses 18 through 20 and then verse 23. Hear you deaf, look you blind and see. Who is blind but my servant, and deaf like the messenger I send? Who is blind like the one in covenant with me, blind like the servant of the Lord? You have seen many things, but have paid no attention. Your ears are open, but you hear nothing. Now this is verse 23. Which of you will listen to this or pay close attention in time to come? Over and over throughout the Old Testament, God gets so frustrated with these people who have eyes that work, but they fail to see. They refuse to see. And ears that can listen, but they won't listen. He gets so frustrated over and over and over again. Now, back to John chapter 9, verse 35. Jesus heard they'd thrown him out, and he went and found him. When he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me, so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him." Imagine what that must have felt like. You're right. I can see. You're the first person to acknowledge that. You have now seen him. In fact, he's the one speaking with you. Now look at how this guy has moved, his progression throughout the course of the chapter. Look back at verse 11. They asked him, "Who opened your eyes?" And he replied, "The man they call Jesus." That's all he knew about him, just this guy they called Jesus. Now look at verse 17. They turn again to the blind man. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "He's a prophet." Now look at verse 33. He says, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. You see, there's a little bit of a forward movement, a little bit of progression, and now he gets to verse 38, and he says, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. Remember how last week we talked about how sometimes it all happens at once, and just all the light bulbs come on, and all the planets line up, and the aha moment, and it all just like a bolt of lightning. For most of us, though, it's a gradual progression, and belief kind of sneaks up on you. And you can't actually say, on this date, at this time is when I started to believe. You just sort of catch yourself believing. This guy says, "You know what? I do believe. I didn't before, and now I do." Now see, when the disciples saw this, well, first of all, when the neighbors saw this guy out there begging, they saw a bother. They saw a nuisance. They saw something that was a reminder of how fallen and dark and depraved our world was and the ravaging effects of sin in our society, and they saw something that they despised. When the disciples saw him, they saw a theological conundrum. How many angels can dance on the head of a pin? That kind of thing. If God is good and God is powerful, if God is loving and God is just, then why is there suffering? And they saw a theological problem. When the Pharisees saw him, they saw a threat to their base of power, to the status quo, somebody who would rock the boat, maybe. When Jesus saw him, Jesus saw an opportunity to do the work of God. What do you see when you see the people around you? When you see the people who are marginalized, when you see the people who are left alone, when you see the people who are ignored by everyone else in our society, what do you see? Theological problem? Threat to the status quo and your base of power? You see a nuisance and a bother? Do you see an opportunity? Opportunities are everywhere around you, and doors are wide open if you'll just have eyes to see them. God, show me what I'm supposed to do. You drive past homeless people every single day. Look right through them. Verse 39. Jesus said, and this is hard. "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, "What, are we blind too?" And Jesus said, "If you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. 2 questions. For those of you who say, oh yes, we love Jesus. Are you paying attention to God? It may require that you turn some things off. That you turn the iPod off, or that you turn the TV off, or you turn the computer off, or you turn whatever else is distracting you off, so that you can get in a quiet place, so that you can pay attention to what God is trying to say to you. It may require that for the first time in a long time you actually open up this book and read the red words and say, okay, what do you want to say? I'm paying attention. What do you want to say to me? Maybe you just spend this week looking at this chapter. Are you paying attention to God? And second, are you paying attention to people? Let's pray. We're done. God, we praise you that nothing happens in our lives that you're unaware of, that not a hair falls out of our head that you don't see, that you notice every single detail, every single aspect of our lives, the good, the bad, the ugly. You know it all. Everything is an open book before your penetrating gaze, and yet you love us completely. You accept us unconditionally. And that overwhelms me. God, I pray that you will open my eyes so that I will be able to see people around me the way you see them. And that I will be able to see the opportunity to do your work while it is still day. That I will be brave enough to walk through the doors that you have opened and to pick up the good deeds that you have placed in my path. That I will be able to see others and this world and myself the way you do. That we'll be able to be more like Jesus, not just in our actions, but in the way we see things and in the things that we hear. That's our prayer tonight, in the name of Jesus. Amen. See you next week.